What kind of conversations are the Leafs having around Matthews and Nylander right now, you think? Is there real concern, actually, in that building?
I think Brad Treliving has done a great job of quieting that down. I really do. And I think, he talked about it before July 1st. July 1st was the massive day that swung the pendulum in the players' favor. But that being said, the way it works is that when the clock strikes midnight, they get their no trade clause and their no move clause. So unless you're putting ink to paper at midnight, there's no way to avoid that. And so it seems to have been such a focal point of that date. But they've got the clauses now, and they gain that much more control. But I think Brad Treliving did a great job of quieting everything down and saying, this isn't going to be done on July 1st. And the simultaneousness of those two things happening, I mean, they refute each other, right? It's like you can't do it. You can't get to that date. You have to get to the date to sign them. But the minute you hit that date, they gain the clauses. And, they're in powerful seats. I mean, flat out. They're both going into their final year. They both produced at an extremely high level. And we'll see how it shakes out. And I think there's a couple of pretty good examples in Nathan MacKinnon. And I was asked at one point to come up with a couple of concrete examples of guys that went past their July 1st recently. Well, Nathan MacKinnon and David Pastrnak both went by it, right? And MacKinnon went into September and Pastrnak went till March. But I immediately came up with those dates, but it was a really funny conversation because I'd gone to the grocery store that day and I was supposed to get 4 things and I forgot 2 of them. But the minute I was asked when a player signed a contract after July 1st, I could remember that Pastrnak was March and MacKinnon was September, but I just couldn't remember those other 2 things at the grocery store.
The avocados are not as important, Dave. That's what it is. That shows
you where my mind is, though, Brendan. You're always thinking about this. You're always thinking of light cases because you want those. If you're the Leafs, you want the light cases because they worked out in favor of the team. And if you're the player, it does take a lot of pressure off to say, okay, this doesn't have to be done on July 1st. But those guys are in powerful seats. They simply are, with UFA looming, and they're different from each other. They get lumped together because of the core 4 and how they've been tightly grouped since they came into the league. But they're very different cases. They'll be handled differently. Don't be surprised if one is with term and one is with shorter term. Don't be surprised, I think by anything that happens. So, once again, I go back to a veteran general manager who came in and I think was able to quiet it down nicely.
Yeah, I think that's important, Poulin, what you just said about these guys being different players in very different circumstances, even though they're both seeking contract extensions, because clearly one's more important than the other. And Matthews is the one that we all assume is going to get done. But as much as Treliving has quieted it to this point, I mean, we're sitting here on August 22nd, pretty quiet time of the year in town, and not a lot is getting done around the sports world, although Julian Breezebrough was busy today and got Hagel signed. It will get louder, Poulin, and I'm wondering, what do you think, Matthews' tolerance for that volume would be? How much do you think he would be, either because we saw Mitch Marner, take it hard when he wasn't signed way back. How do you think Matthews would react to that? And how do you think Treliving, his first time in, a market this size, will be Calgary's no cow town, even though they call it that. How do you think both those two would react to the potential firestorm if this thing isn't done and it drags into a Pastrnak situation a la March?
That's a really hard question, Dave, because I'm not sure we know that much about Auston Matthews.
Yeah. And
by his choice. I mean, with Nylander, we assume he's going to be laissez-faire, right? Like he's simply not going to be concerned about it.
No.
He's going to do what Willie Nylander does. But, you're around that team a lot. You're in the locker room. You're around that team a lot. And, from the group that that are around him on an everyday basis, do you know anyone that knows him really well?
No.
No, and that's by his choice. And so I think that's why that question is so challenging to answer. And, we just don't. And I've talked to people that have known him longer than we have, and they don't know him that well. He's just someone that chooses to remove himself from that everyday And I can't even, come close to discussing what it was like with my beat writers when I played, because it was a different day and age. And we had some veteran guys in Philly, Jay Greenberg, who's left us far too early, and Al Morganti, and then in Boston it was Kevin Paul DuPont and Steve Harris, another guy we lost too early, and guys like that who you had full relationships with.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could sit down, you could have a beverage with them, you could chat with them. It was totally different. And I don't think in today's NHL that virtually anybody has that luxury of getting to know a player that well that you can answer, how do you think he's going to handle it? I just don't. And he's going to defer. His representation will say, like, if this goes into the start of the season, the first thing I would do if I were Auston Matthews is say, I'm not talking about this every day, guys. I am simply not. And I do. The first day I'd say, ask your questions today, because I am not saying another word about it after today. And that's the way I would handle it if I was unsigned and going into it. And, and I would assume that his representation would give him that advice, get it out of the way, and then just play hockey.
And for Treliving, I mean, he's been through a very similar situation with Johnny Gaudreau, right? Where he had a unsigned star player and watched him walk out the door for nothing. I mean, is that a cautionary tale? Is that something you learn from? Is that something you just have to accept as a GM? How do you look at that, Poulin?
Well, to look at it, he's dealt with both cases. He had it happen twice. He had it happen with Johnny Gaudreau, who we did let go, and he tried valiantly to sign him right up to the final, second. I mean, there was substantial offers on the table, which I believe were more than he actually signed for elsewhere. And certainly he was the only one that could offer the additional year. But almost immediately when faced with it again with Matthew Tkachuk, he took the alternate route and said, I'm not dealing with this. I'm dealing with it with Gaudreau. I'm not dealing with it with Tkachuk. I'm making the move and made a major trade. So he's been on both sides of it. So he would learn from his experience and say, I literally can't let happen what happened to Gaudreau, but how would I handle Tkachuk differently if I were given the same situation today? Mm-hmm. And we don't think that's happened with either Nylander or Matthews, or in that same manner where they said we're not going to sign. We haven't heard anything like that. So it's a little bit different, but that would be in the back of his mind. He's had both experiences.